everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Implementing SD-WAN as a Service, Key Considerations and Strategies, sponsored by Juniper Networks. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we'll ask for your feedback. A survey will pop up on your screen and will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day of the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I will now turn the event over to Heavy Reading Principal Analyst Jim Hodges. Jim?
Thanks, Operator, and welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is entitled Implementing SD-WAN as a Service, Key Considerations and Strategies. My name is Jim Hodges, and I will be moderating today's session. So today's session it's very much focused on SD-WAN. We're going to be thinking about or looking at some of the service implications, as well as even some key implementation considerations and strategies for implementing SD-WAN. Let me start first by our session today by introducing our speakers. We have with us 2 speakers today. Next slide, please. We have with us 2 speakers today. Joining us and presenting are Tony Sarachandra, who is the Director of Product Marketing and Cloud Services at Juniper. And we also have with us David Nogar-Bao, who is the Director of Product Marketing of SDN and NFV at Juniper Networks. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having us here.
Okay. So basically, I'd like to start, too, by looking at the agenda slide as well. So if we can push the agenda slide out. So in today's session, what we're going to be doing is we're going to start by presenting some research that Heavy Reading conducted with Juniper that really focused on addressing SD-WAN drivers. So we looked at the linkages between SD-WAN, NFV security requirements, and even some of the vendor selection requirements to really, cement kind of the requirements in kind of a vendor selection context. So I'm going to present really only a subset of the key findings from that research. So what I really want to do is what the intent is to really provide kind of a view of why SD-WAN has really become, I would say, such an important technology over the past 18 months. So again, there's also a white paper. There's a URL at the end of this presentation where there's a white paper that there's a Heavy Reading white paper that provides more information on the research that we did. And then in the second part, Tony is going to drill down and examine how Juniper is implementing SD-WAN and also look at its strategy and how Juniper strategy is really designed to help ensure the commercial requirements are met. And then we'll wrap up and take your questions. We also plan to conduct 2 audience polls related to some of the SD-WAN data points and the concepts that we'll be presenting. So I want to present a couple of research slides, just kind of put things into context. And if you look at this slide, so I'll be presenting about 4 or 5 slides, but we really wanted to, in the research project, really kind of do, as I said, kind of do a level set, really understand SD-WAN drivers from both business and technical level. So we started off the survey with a number of questions. This first question that I'm going to show you, we really just simply asked the survey respondents to kind of rank the SD-WAN deployment drivers in terms of importance. And we gave them a list from OpEx reduction to customer retention. We asked them to rank them from 1 to 11. And the intent of this was really just to kind of give us kind of, as I said, a level set on a view of kind of some of the key drivers. And if you look at this based on the scoring, there's really kind of 4 or 5 that are important, but all the scores are fairly close. The sort of the top 6 or 7 are pretty close. But really what kind of showed to me anyway from this results was that OpEx and CapEx reduction and application performance and driving new revenues are all kind of important. So, I think this is really important on several levels. I think first it shows that there's obviously strong business metrics for SD-WAN, since obviously SD-WAN is less expensive to operate and build an MPLS network. I think it also kind of shows that there's also that the operators, CSPs, are really have a strong application focus. So I think in many respects, it kind of aligns with many of the drivers that we see that CSPs are kind of defining for implementing NFV in the cloud itself. So to me, again, it's kind of consistent with the push for NFV, but I think it does kind of show a kind of a strong business and technical drive on several levels. David, do you have any thoughts on this?
Hi, Jim. Yeah, I think this is consistent with what we see with the customers we talk to. I think the current IPVPN model is OpEx intensive in both provisioning and the track roles of the CPEs. With SD-WAN or deployment of SD-WANs, SPs are looking to take advantage of the zero-touch provisioning, centralized management, customer portals, and this certainly is key. Automation is certainly key for these OpEx savings. So the CapEx part, it's slightly different. So we see that to avoid or to reduce that probably is basically avoiding the vendor lock-in, going for a more open architecture, and also aligning SD-WAN along with other NFV services that can be deployed in the same platform and consolidate on less hardware, therefore less CapEx as well. The increased revenues, which is probably slightly lower here, it's not a surprise. So we don't see many service providers looking at SD-WAN as a big source for additional revenues, and this is more a response to customer needs currently.
Okay, yeah, good points. I think you've kind of nailed it on the head there in terms of kind of how both OpEx and CapEx kind of come together to sort of kind of drive a lot of this. And I think this is something we're going to see even more in the next couple of months as we move forward. Okay, I'm going to present another research slide. On this one, really what we wanted to do is we talked a little bit about SD-WAN and VNFs and kind of sort of how it sort of aligns with NFV in general. And obviously SD-WAN will be software provisionable and it'll utilize a VNF architecture. So we really wanted to understand kind of how some of the VNFs, or I guess some of the relative importance of VNFs in kind of a larger context. We wanted to include SD-WAN in there. So we wanted to understand kind of the intersection of security services, managed communication services, customized managed services in SD-WAN, even virtual CP. Really, all of these things from a business perspective are somewhat intertwined in terms of how you use VNF to kind of drive that new OpEx and CapEx. So as you can see here, security services were kind of the top scoring or the top rank opportunity, and then managed communication services, and then SD-WAN, and also customized managed services. So again, I see this important on a number of levels. On the previous slide, we saw CapEx and OpEx reductions. But to me, this also kind of shows that from a service perspective, there's also an opportunity as well. So if you think about it from a security perspective, I think there are clearly a number of new business opportunities associated with SD-WAN that are security-driven because, unlike MPLS, SD-WAN will support encryption. So I think this kind of, to me, opens the door to supporting new customized managed services, including security services. Since obviously if you implement SD-WAN as pure software VNF, there's a lot more opportunity to sort of, I guess, develop specialized or custom services for enterprises or in a multi-tenant environment. So again, David, any sort of thoughts on this from your perspective?
Yeah, probably the first thing is very interesting to see SD-WAN in the top 3 services when probably a couple of years back it didn't even show up in that list, right? When we tracked those lists for a period of time, we'd see that SD-WAN wasn't considered a VNF, and now it's in the top 3. Probably also having security as one of the key drivers for NFV, along with managed communications. Those 2 services are the bread and butter for managed services, and probably together with SD-WAN now, we see that those services are the key pillars to sustain the investment into a virtual managed services platform that ultimately probably is this virtual CPE that we see a little bit lower, but this is the platform that unifies all the different VNFs in one delivery.
Yeah, and you make a good point about SD-WAN. I think sort of the market momentum of SD-WAN has been phenomenal over the last 18 months, and I think for me, the part that I didn't quite understand initially when SD-WAN sort of started coming as kind of a really important technology is just how programmability can be sort of leveraged to create these services. And obviously when you look at some of the use cases that Tony's going to present, there's a lot of flexibility there, and I think that's kind of what's driving this. Okay, let's move on. because we're talking about NFV and VNS, we also wanted to understand sort of the implications of MANO, so management and network orchestration, so network management and orchestration. So really what we wanted to do was, again, in this research project, we wanted to sort of get a kind of a linkage between sort of the attributes that an NFV MANO solution would have to have. And this kind of applies to sort of any VNF, not just SD-WAN VNF. So we gave the survey respondents, the CSPs, kind of a broad list from scalability down to open API integration, multi-data center orchestration, end-to-end real-time historical monitoring. You can see here kind of the top four with sort of the highest marks were scalability, automation, basically service agility or agile service design, and resiliency. So I think, to me, this is kind of, I think, really important on a number of different levels. I think it kind of shows that there is really kind of obviously a requirement to be able to have really a highly scalable solutions from a MANO perspective. And I think over the last 12 to 18 months, there's been a lot of discussion in the industry about sort of how to implement MANO and how to optimize it so you don't have kind of you basically do achieve scalability and automation. And I think again, if you look at these top four themselves, I think this also kind of translates again to sort of the requirements that NFV has. Any sort of cloud implementation, it has to be scalable, it has to be fully automated, it has to be agile, and it has to be resilient. So I think my take on this is that MANO is really an important part of scaling and automating kind of any VNS, but that also applies to SD-WAN VNS. And again, David, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think just probably small comment on probably looking at MANO on SD-WAN as a service, being a carrier-grade offer, having scalability, openness, resiliency. I think those are kind of absolutely needed for that type of infrastructure. Automation shows very high, and it's very important. I think service providers have learned the lesson, and without automation, it's hard to achieve some of the operating benefits. And when they look at to implement new infrastructure, MANO, or new services, the automation is ranking very high because the last thing they want is another big OpEx gap into their organization and structure.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, one of the things I wanted to mention, and you touched on it, is that in some respects you could take scalability and say that kind of has a direct impact on CapEx, and you could take automation and you could say that has a direct impact on OpEx, because obviously automation is all about automating provisioning processes and things like that. So both of those two, scalability and automation, if you kind of think about that previous slide that kind of links it to CapEx and OpEx, there is kind of a strong line. Same with agility. Agility kind of cuts both ways, both CapEx and OpEx, and obviously resiliency is kind of network performance. So yeah, so I think you're right. It kind of aligns with the previous slide as well. Okay, I'm going to present two more slides from research, and really what we wanted to do was we really wanted to understand how this kind of equates, how all these considerations and these drivers kind of really kind of influence decision-making processes. So we want to understand sort of the attributes that customers and service providers basically consider when they select SD-WAN vendors. We're going to look at SD-WAN vendors and security vendors as well, because obviously there's a tight, close linkage between SD-WAN and security services. So again, we asked the survey respondents to give us kind of a view of kind of the top requirements that they considered when they were selecting an SD-WAN vendor. And again, there's a large, broad range of them, but interesting, things like existing account preference were kind of at the lower, things like advisory and new services, business models, perceived industry innovative. Those things were important, but really kind of, I guess, when you came down to it, that kind of the key driver, I guess the key attributes that the CSP saw were the ability to support OSPF integration. Price obviously is important, but also virtualization product roadmap and POC, proof of concept trial performance are kind of the top four. And I guess this is too much of a surprise. I think one of the key takeaways for me is that CSPs are really looking to their vendors to help them deliver products that have viable roadmaps, at the price points they're going to need to basically achieve those reductions in OpEx and CapEx. And I think really I think another key takeaway is that it's really important that I think SD-WAN technology is really an important part of them being able to kind of help realize the migration to the cloud to make sure that they can do that, but also be able to build it and support sort of a seamless integration. So, David, what are your views on this? Any surprises here?
No, not at all. I think the reason, looking at OSS and BSS integration, for example, I think it's since SD-WAN is not perceived as a service that will run standalone, that this will be part of a wider offering. This is key and mandatory. They won't build a separate infrastructure, must be integrated. It talks about integration. It doesn't say that it must have a dedicated OSS BSS, which I think this is key. It's just having that integration in existing systems. And you're right on the price. I think I have a similar reading. I mean, we saw in some previous slides that SPs are not looking for huge additional revenues coming from SD-WAN. Therefore, the investment they put here must be paid off by the savings they are getting on OpEx and CapEx, and the customer satisfaction that will go up. But this is something that I need to look after. Price is not just the cost of the VNF, so it's not just the cost of the infrastructure, it's also the licensing models that are offered. What are the upfront investments they need to make? How is this to set up and turn down some of those licenses? And I think all that composes this price offering. Maybe the only surprise is to see the breadth of professional services being so low, where we know that those implementations and integrations won't be always easy, and probably, well, as long as professional services probably offers coverage in the areas where they have the centralized deployment, that should be fine. But we believe that this is key, because this period of setting up those systems needs to be completely supported by the vendor.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, and obviously integration, OSS BSS integration does kind of obviously have sort of a professional services role as well. Okay, good point. I'm going to move on to the last slide, which is kind of the same question, but in the context of security, because as I said, security was kind of an important topic in terms of security services, security capability. And I think if you look at security, the number one driver was interesting virtualization roadmap, which was I think number 3 or 4 in the previous slide. But really, these top four are kind of this identical between security and SD-WAN vendors. Maybe the order is a little bit different. Price was second in this one as well. Ability to support OSS BSS integration was previously in the top one here. It's third, but these are all pretty tightly scored, and the marks are pretty close together. So, but it's interesting. We also see vendor with both IT and network domain skill sets, which makes sense because obviously you're supplying a lot of edge capabilities or security capabilities at the edge. So I guess, for me is that, again, service providers are really looking towards the vendors to really give them these products that have, very strong security capabilities, and it's really going to help them kind of be able to meet their requirements as they migrate and as they implement SD-WAN, FDN, and also NFV as well. Again, one last final opportunity for you, David. Any thoughts on this one? Yeah, some quick thoughts. So first of all, service providers deploying SD-WAN, they will soon understand the need for security. I mean, security to many people is there on SD-WAN just because SD-WAN implements IPsec, but we all know that IPsec is only one piece of it. IPsec is implemented to interconnect, the branch to branch or branch to headquarter traffic. But how about the traffic that now is offloaded directly from each branch office to the internet? Exactly. All this traffic before, it went through centralized security gateways, and now it just goes directly. So the enterprise as well will be looking at ways to provide UTM services like web filtering or antivirus in a very distributed manner. And this means that they need heavy investment on number of gateways now very, very distributed. So I think price is important, the ability again to have it very, centralized management, OSS integration. All those things are critical, and virtualization, this is top now. It will be probably what makes it very easy or much easier to deploy in this platform approach. Yeah, and that makes sense. And just to wrap this up quickly, but you're right. I think virtualization product roadmap for security is, as you said, it's critical, it's crucial because like you said, security is much more than just encryption. There's a whole bunch of other things in terms of policies and things like that have to be considered. Okay, we're going to move on to Tony's presentation, but before we do that, we want to ask you, the audience, get your insight into this. We're going to conduct our first poll here. So the poll question is, what's the importance of having SD-WAN integrated with existing IP VPN services? We're going to be talking about this more in the second part in Tony's presentation, but I think it's an important question because obviously SD-WAN has a role to play in integration with existing IP VPN services. So if we can get you, the audience, to provide that, it would be helpful. And I guess also kind of, David, while we're waiting just maybe for the audience, you had talked a little bit about security and encryption. I'm just wondering, as when you talk to your customers about implementing a security service for SD-WAN, do they kind of start with encryption and then kind of layer on policies, or how do you kind of develop sort of a holistic strategy to kind of do that?
Well, it depends pretty much on the use case they are thinking for SD-WAN. If SD-WAN is to provide mechanisms to replace IPVPN by using IPsec tunnels, right, probably there is not much change on the security architecture they have currently. But when we see many cases of using SD-WAN to start offloading traffic directly into the internet from the branch office, so it doesn't have to go through IPsec into a centralized location, the only place where you can put that security in place is in each branch office. So here is where we see that need of offering, since SD-WAN opens up new security risks, therefore from in the same hand of the SD-WAN, it should come the security solution. And here's where the opportunity is created for service providers.
Exactly. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let me see here. Importance of SD-WAN with existing. So 32% said it's critical, 57% said it's important. So any surprises here? I kind of expected sort of critical to be sort of about a third of the responses. So that's pretty much, any surprises here from your perspective?
Well, it's quite high, yeah. I think no one, just few part of the audience would see that as marginal, which I think it's a big sign. Obviously, it will be critical, the integration for those service providers that they have IPVPN services currently. For those that maybe don't have it, or they are not very dominant in IPVPN market, maybe they don't see that is important, but not that critical because they are not that big in that space. But yeah, I think that's very consistent on what we're seeing from a service provider audience.
Okay. With that, now I'm going to turn the presentation over to you, Tony, and you're going to spend a little bit more time talking about sort of the service implication of SD-WAN. So I'll push out your first slide, and you're good to go.
Great. Thanks, Jim and David. So I wanted to give the folks on the call a quick view of, if you're a CSP or an SP or offering sort of existing VPN services, how you would potentially evolve, towards SD-WAN, right? Which is kind of a key topic if you're in the SP communications industry. So it's important, before we tackle that point, to understand a little bit about, how we kind of got here, right? For those of us who've been in the industry for 15, 20 plus years, there's been a number of seismic changes in terms of connectivity services that have evolved in the networking industry, right? Particularly in service providers, right? So in the mid to late 90s, there was from lease line to transition to frame relay-based services, and of course in the early 2000s, the adoption of IP MPLS VPNs in both layer 3 and layer 2, which really spurred the whole VPN movement, right? And then, in the mid 2000s, the advent of the mobile workers and the remote office kind of spurred the advent of hybrid WAN and remote access, through IPsec VPN client terminations into MPLS VPN services, right? And I think, certainly from our perspective here at Juniper, we see the evolution into SD-WAN as kind of the next logical step of the connectivity service transitions that we have gone through over the last 2 decades or so, right? And the reason is, as Jim and David mentioned, in a lot of cases today, internet-based connectivity is good enough for most applications, right? And that allows a level of cost saving for the end enterprise that just cannot be afforded to be ignored, quite frankly, right? So, and service providers and CSPs are taking notice of this and looking at how can they evolve their services to meet these underlying enterprise needs, right? So that's kind of what's happening in the market today. But I do also see a further evolution where particularly as more and more applications to cloud, the connectivity between branch to branch is going to become potentially less important than branch to cloud, right? Where, more volumes of traffic are going towards basically, north-south direction versus an east-west direction from an enterprise perspective, right? So we see this as a kind of a, step where, applications are moving to cloud, and then, increasingly your information workers within enterprises will connect direct to cloud in some cases as well, right? So if we that's kind of the broader picture, right? But let's kind of double click on what's specifically happening in the IPVPN market, right? Particularly with MPLS services, if you look at various reports, and this is one in particular, North America and Western Europe, there's declines predicted, from previous years to the next 3-4 years, right? Depending on the market and the geo in question. At the same time, there's a significant anticipated forecasted ramp up of SD-WAN spend and SD-WAN infrastructure, right? And partly, I think this would offset the MPLS decline, but to David's point, so which is about maintaining the existing customer base. But another part of this is there are new customers that may have not offered or consumed these services coming into the market, right? And so both of these are sort of driving this projected phenomenal growth in the next 5 years or so, right? So I think that's sort of makes the market very ripe for disruption, yeah. And so particularly if you, as David said, and Jim pointed out, if you're coming from a service provider, and if you have existing legacy IPVPN services, which a lot of service providers do, you gotta have a strategy to take your customer base where the market is headed, right? And so that's kind of where I think we can potentially offer a kind of a very unique value proposition. So in this slide, the present mode of operation, what you see here on the left-hand side is your typical IPVPN, right, with MPLS-based core, branch sites on the edge, and potentially a remote access via IPsec connection for remote offices or telecommuted workers. And, cloud-based access can be had either directly or through, typically through gateway functionality within the IPVPN itself, right? Whether that functionality is offered at the, by the service provider or at the enterprise headquarters site, right? So if you fast forward, how can this existing service sort of at a high level, if you will, be SD-WAN enabled, right? And SD-WAN's primary value proposition is cost saving in the last mile, right? And mid-mile services are difficult to notoriously optimize if you don't necessarily control the infrastructure. So from a branch perspective, the most bang for the buck will occur where you can, reduce that dependency on, physical circuits that you lease from your service provider and go to, a unbundled offering or a bundled offering, but, at a cheaper price point from a broadband or internet connectivity service, right? So what's shown here from a FMO or a future mode of operation here is that the branches now are suddenly connected to the internet as well as MPLS. But when you connect to the internet connection is purely an underlay service. And you basically run an overlay back into your MPLS VPN to provide connectivity to the sites that may not have had SD-WAN services enabled. And there'll be a lot of those as, large enterprise organizations go through migration and transitions of thousands and thousands of sites. So the transition is going to take probably 2 to 3 years, right? So having connectivity between existing IP MPLS VPNs and newer SD-WAN connected sites are going to be absolutely key. The second point I wanted to kind of point out here is the point that sort of Jim and David also mentioned earlier, is the moment that you are no longer on a private lines network with a sort of a trusted infrastructure, your branch site is suddenly exposed to all the bad guys out there, right? So whether you like it or not, perimeter security at the branch becomes increasingly important, right? And perimeter security in the sense of, defending and protecting your branch infrastructure and the infrastructure that and the applications and the data that sits behind that, right? So at each of these sites now, whereas, in previous model, you might have had a perimeter firewall at the headquarters site or offered as a service by your service provider, perimeter security within the branch now becomes paramount, right? Regardless of whether you go to SaaS or whether you go to site for your connectivity, right? So those are kind of the key points that I wanted to kind of point out in this particular slide. So moving on, let's look at, what are some of the key considerations if you are a service provider or even a large enterprise in terms of how you would phase in some of this SD-WAN service, right? So the first thing that's kind of showed in this slide is that, a base SD-WAN is all about visibility, right? It's about getting visibility into the network, into the applications, getting the analytics from the network so that you understand where are your applications, constrained, and where do you have the ability to perhaps optimize your network. And so that's kind of, offered by pretty much every SD-WAN vendor out there, including Juniper, where, you have application-based path selection with the advent of, centralized policy management, which, is another sort of word for, complete automation of your branch experience and management, lifecycle management aspects, right? So, David mentioned the ZTP aspect, which is a huge cost saving, whether you're enterprise or a service provider, regardless. The fact that you can see the traffic that is going on either of these WAN links or more of the WAN links, right? And having the ability to granularly see that in a fairly structured way is invaluable to the IT operations within an enterprise or a service provider. The other key point here is that the architecture that is going to dominate, in our opinion, moving forward, particularly with the telecommunications, is you're not going to replace a multi-geography IP MPLS backbone within a set of overlay tunnels anytime soon, right? These are large networks that have evolved over the last 10, 15 years, as I mentioned, which are, global and have, north of, 100,000 endpoints and are fully multi-tenant, right? And so where SD-WAN, I think, does offer a critical value to the service provider and enterprise is clearly in the last mile. And in the last mile, where the cost saving and the visibility of the application can drive that cost saving that is optimized towards the enterprise, particularly when cloud applications are driving the traffic growth from that branch into the network, right? So that's kind of the key takeaway that I kind of wanted to kind of set the stage with. And whether you're a service provider or an enterprise, that is where the cost savings and the increasing operational efficiencies will come from. So if you look at it from what are the options, right? If I'm an enterprise, what are the options that I can choose to do for in particular SaaS in terms of how I would optimize my network architecture and traffic flow within my network for those SaaS applications, right? This is kind of the traditional model, as I mentioned earlier, where you have a hub site at the HQ. Typically, your CSO dictates that all traffic going between your private network and the internet must go through that subsite for compliance and policy security posture enforcement. And this is pretty typical for most enterprises today. And the perimeter firewall can be either at the headquarters site or a managed service by the service provider within their infrastructure, right? But this is a kind of a hairpin scenario, as can be seen, right? The evolving model here is that, as increasingly traffic is moving to the cloud, it becomes economically unfeasible to loop all of the traffic through that hub site, right? A, you're paying for, access bandwidth into your VPN. B, you're paying for the cost of transit between the branch sites and the hub site. And C, you're going to incur substantial costs in the hub site to meet with your growing bandwidth needs, right? And so the most, economical option here is, local breakout at the branch for SaaS applications, that, comply with business security posture considerations, right? And these are typically applications like, Salesforce.com or Office 365, et cetera, which, are purely offered in a SaaS model, right? And so that is a clear benefit, and a lot of enterprises have already moved to this model. If you're a retail or a healthcare provider, where you have guest Wi-Fi services, guest Wi-Fi is already implemented using this model, right? And the next evolution of that would be for SaaS-based applications, clearly. The other option here is that you could choose to do a regional breakout, right? So rather than having a much more distributed perimeter security, you can have a node within the VPN service, pick that application and do an optimized egress at a regional breakout point. And the advantage of this is, you get a slightly better SLA because, you're not hitting the variation between the local broadband provider at the branch. And so, if performance to your SaaS apps is a key business critical need, this typically is a good option that most enterprises would go for. And then a much more stringent option still would be where, you actually have a direct connect, right, which is typically a high SLA link between your IPVPN service and that SaaS provider. And that can be achieved in a number of ways. But the key point that I want to kind of emphasize here, in each case, you need visibility into that SaaS application, right, for complete flexibility of the traffic as well as routing of that traffic to the right egress endpoint within the network. So the other key point, just transitioning from that point, is that if you're a service provider and looking to implement and augment existing IP MPLS with SD-WAN, you have a couple of different options. Firstly, if in the architecture that I presented earlier, you're going to have to bring your SD-WAN edge sites into a consolidation point, which is typically a gateway of some sort. But you're already doing that in most cases for existing MPLS services. And that device is typically your PE infrastructure that is front-ending all of your business services within your customer base for your existing service. And so, it makes, economic sense, right? Certainly makes, operational sense where if you were to look at consolidating some of these services in your existing PE infrastructure, it may gain you some operational efficiencies, certainly, cost efficiencies where you do not need to certify and procure and stand up new equipment or software within your POP or data center for termination of these SD-WAN connections. So what's important in consideration of such an infrastructure is that the gateway be fully multi-tenant capable, right? Preferably be existing device of some sort, ability to support symmetrical, scalable flow routing, right? So that, your DPI for application selection happens on the CPE, but you don't want to do DPI at 100 gigabits within your POP infrastructure. That clearly is a cost prohibitive option, right? So there are ways around that. which certain vendors implement, including certainly Juniper. And then the other option is you really need to have scalable hardware-based encryption to terminate these high number of IPsec tunnels that are possibly coming in from your internet peering points, right, for broadband offload. And then the last point here is, the ability to interwork with your existing VPN infrastructure, exchange routes with your VRFs within your PE can be also a key decision point to allow seamless traffic connectivity between your SD-WAN enabled sites and potentially your legacy IP MPLS VPN only connected sites, right? So that's an important distinction to look through and consolidate or consider if you're a service provider looking to launch SD-WAN as a service. So let's look at, moving on, let's look at some of the deployment scenarios, right, that, enterprise customers are typically looking at and why, service providers in particular should look at all of these options when considering SD-WAN as a service to their customer base, right? So the first is probably, the previous slide, which just shows kind of the typical architecture, right? Where you have an MPLS network which provides transit between the hub sites or the branch sites, but really the tunnels terminate within the service provider's POP infrastructure, right? And use MPLS core backbone as a transit across inter-region or inter-network in some cases that span across regions, right? Given to the scale problem that I alluded to earlier. If you look at the first scenario, right, which is shown here, which is a SD-WAN connected site with a single internet connection, right? And what's kind of unique here is that this is not a new concept. It's very similar to the remote office concept that I mentioned at the start of the presentation. What's new here is that you have your IPsec tunnel that is terminating into your provider infrastructure, but the whole process is completely automated, right? So gone are the days where you have to send a technician outside to configure and stand up the CPE, provide complex IPsec configuration to provision the CPE to connect it back to the head end, determine accurate routing between the local LAN and the MPLS network, et cetera, right? All of that is completely automated by the SD-WAN provisioning and automation system, right? And so that is really where the cost savings for the service provider comes in, and also the benefits for the enterprise, right? When you order a site, the site can potentially be up in matter of hours, particularly if you have LTE connectivity with an internet-based connection that you can connect back into your IP MPLS VPN. And this is increasingly becoming the de facto mode of site turnup for greenfield sites, even within existing enterprise infrastructure. The second option here is where you have a remote office, but you don't want to provision or obtain a expensive IP MPLS link that is traditionally provided by your service provider with a managed SLA and a guarantee. Rather, you would go with, say, 2 or more providers for your underlay broadband, and then run 2 overlays for redundancy as well as load sharing and offering the ability to have SLA management on a per application basis across those dual links in the last mile back into your head-end infrastructure within the service provider environment, right? So the advantage of this is obviously redundancy of WAN links, but second, the ability to have more granular SLA management, given that you have alternate paths, particularly if you're using multiple ISPs for that last mile connectivity, right? So they might have different peering points, different handoffs, different congestion scenarios for broadband and peak times and so forth that you might be able to work around with typical SD-WAN, ability to traffic, manage and load balance appropriately based on the SLA characteristics of the individual applications that you particularly care about as an enterprise user, right? So that's kind of a second scenario with dual internet. And then the typical scenario, which I showed earlier, is also, where one, you might choose to connect or you might have an existing site where you have a remote office with an MPLS connection, but you will augment it, typically with a broadband connection with an overlay network with writing IPsec back into your MPLS network, right? And now you have best of both worlds. You can choose to route perhaps your, high SLA traffic, like video and mission critical data across your, directly connected CEPE link, and then, perhaps less critical, traffic can easily be, shunted over to the broadband-based overlay link back into your MPLS VPN as well, right? And the two provide backups for each other, right, at the right level of guarantees for applications. So that's kind of the most common scenario that we see, certainly enterprises adopting, and this will be the first evolutionary step towards the previous model of dual internet that I showed earlier. So those are the common models that I think service providers should think through, right? But the key point being, how do you connect those services cleanly and in a scalable manner to your existing IP MPLS VPN services? So let's sort of having said that sort of stage, let's look at what does Juniper offer specifically in this area when it comes to Juniper's SD-WAN solution. So the first aspect of it is, having baseline visibility into the site and into the applications that are transiting that site is absolutely key, both for the enterprise as well as the service provider who wants to offer an SD-WAN service to the enterprise, right? So the ability to easily visualize those applications, see the state of the connections, whether they're up or down, which links are carrying which applications at a given point in time, are all key valuable aspects of an SD-WAN service that should be, kind of table stakes for the service provider to offer to the enterprise, right? And this comes both from an application perspective as well as an SLA perspective, right? The other aspect is the ability to see time series data, right? So not only a particular point in time, but hey, I had a application event, let's say 24 hours ago. I want to go back and see what the network was doing and the performance metrics for the network 24 hours ago, right? Or 7 days ago, or 18 days ago, right? And this data should be readily available and accessible to the enterprise user, right, through a managed service, right? So that clearly means you're going a step above and beyond what typical IP MPLS VPN services do today, right? And so that is a key part of the value add that a service provider should make a main sort of table stake part of the existing or a part of an SD-WAN offer moving forward. And then the same applies for SLA visibility, right? So SLA meaning, packet loss, jitter, round trip time, delay, all of these metrics, impact application performance and, at various points in the network. And the ability to have that visibility and go back in time, see what the network was doing is, invaluable from an enterprise IT operations perspective, and certainly something that will add value to a SD-WAN service, regardless of the connectivity piece that I mentioned earlier. So what does this take from a Juniper perspective, particularly to implement, right? And what do we offer to our customers and to the market at large? So the first thing is, this is a kind of a fairly complicated diagram with a lot of blocks. But the first thing, I want to emphasize is that it's an open end-to-end architecture. All of the blocks are modular with cleanly defined APIs, and the architecture provides the choice for the service provider to implement which of the specific capabilities that they see as key needs within their particular customer base. The first thing I want to kind of draw your attention on is, the ability to have a telco cloud infrastructure and particularly offer additional services behind IP MPLS VPNs can be a sweetener in some cases, and this is certainly a capability we bring to the table in the overall sort of cloud CPE architecture that we offer from Juniper. The second is that the ability to have a network services controller that manages the CPEs, provides the lifecycle management of the CPEs, and that ZTP and operational efficiency and automation is the second key point that I want to kind of bring out as well. And the third key point is, through some kind of service orchestrator, the ability to have a self-care portal and expose some of this information to the end user. Again, the ability to share that information and have the end user visible to that information is absolutely key to the value of the actual service being offered, right? And then the fourth is, the ability to support VNS, and Jim and David talked about this earlier. You can offer SD-WAN as a independent service, or you can offer SD-WAN as a complete virtualized service, right? And increasingly, what service providers are choosing to do is they're choosing to go with a platform that enables complete virtualization of any service, and then looking to add SD-WAN as one of the services, as shown by the poll that Jim shared earlier, critical to their service catalog, right? And of course, the ability to cleanly offer security together with SD-WAN is an additional service uplift that the service provider can offer together with SD-WAN as they launch this kind of service. A lot of these customers already have managed security offerings that are physical device-based offerings, and those offerings are clearly moving into a virtualized form factor. So just to kind of move on, so how do we see this architecture evolving, right? The first is that the termination point at the provider edge can certainly also be virtualized, right? So it basically allows a service provider to either leverage your existing PE deployment, or take that PE deployment and move it into your virtual infrastructure as they move towards a telco cloud-based service model, right, and evolution. The second is the ability to add that automation into the CPE controller highlighted in yellow with SD-WAN, right? So there's aspects of the CPE lifecycle management, which are a core part of the ZTP of bringing the platform up. But then there's also aspect of managing SD-WAN and the associated overlay topology and the associated routing between the sites, et cetera, which needs to be managed by the CPE controller. And then the fourth one here is the self-care portal, having the visibility that I alluded to earlier, and having the analytics collected by the CPE controller easily accessible to the enterprise customer so that they can see that visualization both from an application usage perspective across the multiple WAN paths, as well as a time series perspective in terms of data, whether it's 24 hours, 7 days, or 18 days in the history of the network behavior. And then the last piece is having the ability to have a distributed NFV capability on the branch site, including SD-WAN, and then having a clear path to moving to away from traditional CPEs towards more of a x86 infrastructure that David alluded to, which drives a lot of the CapEx saving, in addition to the OpEx saving that comes from automation that SD-WAN brings to the picture. So just to kind of wrap up, So key strategies, right, and considerations in summary. Integrated security is a must as you move your branches to be internet-facing, right? So that's a point that I sort of made at the start of the presentation. Having a clean architecture that enables SD-WAN together with other telco cloud use cases such as VCPE and managed security can also be an additional advantage. Adherence to open standards, right? This is one I did not mention, but a lot of the SD-WAN vendors today out in the market are very closed and proprietary. And there's a movement now towards, opening that up and actually having interoperability between them. And having interoperability between existing infrastructure and SD-WAN-based edge services, right? This is going to be a key to having SD-WAN services mature and really take off in the market, particularly in the service provider space. And then fourth is, the full ability to do routing and integrate with your existing MPLS services. So, having BGP, ISIS, things of that nature can be important for a service provider when they're looking to integrate existing sites with new SD-WAN service offerings. And so the SD-WAN vendor needs to support these technologies cleanly and maturely out of the box. The fifth here is, the ability to have the x86 CPEs. It's all great that, that you have VNFs, but at the end of the day, to operationalize a service as a service provider, you need a platform to run the VNFs. And David mentioned that as well. And having integrated platform from a specific vendor certainly assists in operationalizing and the commercial aspects of rolling out an SD-WAN service independently of the VNF. And then the last is the ability to have multi-tenancy and having the ability to manage that multi-tenancy at scale. Because no longer are we talking about a single network having, 5,000 sites or 10,000 sites. We're talking about a large global service provider network having up to 100,000 sites or more, right, connected across countries across the globe. So SD-WAN really needs to step up and have that ability to support that type of architecture, and that's an important consideration for a service provider looking to launch that kind of service. So those are kind of my key takeaways that I would recommend the audience to ponder about. At this point, I will hand it back over to Jim. I believe, Jim, you have an additional poll question.
Right. We've got a few minutes left. So excellent presentation, Tony. I wish we had a little bit more time to do some excellent technical meat in this presentation. But we only have a couple of questions from the audience, so I let Tony's presentation go a little bit longer so he could present a lot of the great material he's got here. But we wanted to conduct a poll question, and we want to understand from you, the audience, what is the importance of having security integrated with SD-WAN solutions. We talked about that in one of the slides. And so while we're waiting for that audience, I'm going to ask either you, David, or Tony, one of the questions that came in that was kind of related to SD-WAN and sort of managed services. And the question is, do you think SD-WAN will be widely available without the service being a managed service from the service providers? So I guess that kind of goes back to the business model.
Yeah, let me take that. This is David, since it's a business question. So what we see is that there are two phases of any service introduction. We have the early adopters now, where they won't wait for SD-WAN being available as a managed service. They can do it themselves. They have the skills, they have the needs, so they'll be doing that. But certainly over time, we see that when the rest of the enterprises are joining the SD-WAN move, there'll be more SD-WAN as a service models available, and the vast majority of SD-WAN deployments will be through that model, in our opinion.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. I'm just going to push the results out here. Actually, not too much of a surprise, so kind of goes back to the slides from our research project that I did with you. Critical is the number one answer, so not much of a surprise there. Okay, we want to take a couple more questions, but I also want to point out that there's a white paper, and there's more information at this URL that we've got in this slide for the audience. It includes a white paper that I did with Juniper. So there's you're able to get access to that white paper at this link, and it's kind of a white paper that shows some of the research that we did as well. So you have this link, and one other kind of housekeeping bit of information is I'll push out a link right now for you, the audience, to provide us information into today's session. If you can provide us feedback on today's session, it will help us plan for future sessions in the future. But while we're waiting, maybe we can take one more question. The question is, I guess, can SD-WAN meet or exceed SLA requirements? You talked, Tony, about some of the requirements running in a hybrid. Mm-hmm. Is that something that's a concern?
Yes. In effect, yes, right? For most networks today, right, even for applications like voice over IP that are highly SLA dependent and critical, broadband access in most developed countries have evolved to the point where the SLA requirements can be easily met, right? The question mark comes in. It really depends on where, right? So if you're looking at some of the for example outskirts outside the metros and into the rural and regional areas, perhaps the answer would vary, but in most cases the answer is yes. So I would agree, right, that certainly I think that the phenomenon of traffic moving over to broadband has started and will certainly increase and continue.
Okay. Well, that kind of actually addresses the questions we had from the audience as well. So I think we're going to stop there. We're past the top of the hour. So again, Tony and David, excellent presentations here from you today. I really appreciate it. I think it gave the audience a lot of technical meat to think about as they ponder their SD-WAN strategies. So again, thanks for creating the material and presenting today, and also I'd like to thank you, the audience, for attending today's session. And for Light Reading, this is Jim Hodges. Again, thanks everyone for attending, and we hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.